Thank you so much, Charles and Kevin, and for inviting me to give a little talk and open some discussions and continued discussions, as you mentioned, as all of our organizations started and had a starting point and have expanded and grown and flowed forward. So we continue to do that, and I'm happy to be there and see your work and see everybody's work in community and the importance of that and the importance of intersections and continuing conversations. So my name is Santee Tekaronhiáhkhwa Kahnyen'kehàka Nation. My name is Santee Smith. My Ongwahoe name, my Kahnyen'kehàka name is Tekaronhiáhkhwa, which means picking up the sky. And I am from the Kahnyen'kehàka Nation, which is also known as the Mohawk Nation, and I'm from the Anoala Turtle Clan, and also from Oswego, which is also known as Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And I'm the artistic director of Kahawi, and I'll say what Kahawi means. Kahawi is a Kahnyen'kehà word that means to carry, and that's what my company does, is carry forward stories and culture and designs, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But also, we are based in Oswego in our treaty territory, and Tekaronto, or if you were saying it from a Kahnyen'kehà way of saying you and pronunciation, you would say Tegalondo, because T is a D sound and K is a G sound, so you would say Tegalondo. So before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge, as Charles did, the living creative universe, from all of its entities and beings, from the smallest insect to blades of grass to the cosmos, and what we would deliver and keep in our minds that we are a part of this interconnected web, and human beings being one small aspect to that. And with that comes our responsibilities to be caretakers, to be life sustainers, and to support and sustain all of the living entities, but also to be grateful for all of the living entities and to acknowledge them continuously and every day. And a lot of the times we do that through the Ohondu Galiwategwe, the Thanksgiving address, which is an address oration that could be a very shortened version, maybe 7 to 10 minutes, or it could be a whole day, because you would think every living fish, like every insect that you would know. And so that's really important. That's foundational to what I do at Kahawi Dance Theater and for me as an individual. So I'll be speaking about that later, because it has to do with how we want to envision the work that we're doing in our own organizations, and also in how we are in relation with others, not only our main collaborators, but others within community. And I'll let you know a little bit of my background, but also what we're working on, because this is a working, developing, evolving, growing process that has been initiated since Kahawi, when I started as an individual artist, each year expanding and opening. So I'll share some of our discoveries, and I'll share some perspectives that are very much centered on Ongwahoeneha. And Ongwahoeneha means everything to do with being an Ongwahoe person in community. Our traditional ways, which are ancient, but also can apply to today and take into consideration future generations. What decisions that we make today will affect 7 generations moving forward. So we're always thinking about actions and mind-heart connections. And I'll speak a little bit about that. So I want to share a PowerPoint, and just bear with me as I get this going. And I'll speak as we're sharing this, and you'll get to see some images and some words. And then later, after that is done, come back and close. And hopefully, if there's comments or questions, you can put them in the chat, or we can have a little bit of discussion after that. So now I go here, I'm going to share my screen. This is an opening picture. Everything here is really important. This is a work that we're working on called Homelands, this picture. And we are standing in our traditional territory in upstate New York. And it's about, I've been working about how to connect to our traditional lands, and what many people don't realize, even within Turtle Island, that many nations have been dislocated and moved from their traditional homelands where they would have, gone through treaty negotiations. And generally, we've been moved from this beautiful, serene, rolling foothills of the Adirondack Mountains to the least fertile, the least picturesque lands in swamplands, and what we have now in Oswego, which now is now the place where there's actually a lot of green space left, because the importance of maintaining our connection and maintaining those relationships to the natural world. So that's important, as are the pottery pieces that we're holding as dramaturgical models. So before I go into what we're working on, I really think it's important that I share my acknowledgement to my ancestors, and particularly from my matrilineal side, because traditionally Ongwahoi people were very much about equalness, egalitarian society, but the women, the matriarchs, were really powerful, equal contributors. The sense of feminine force as life-sustaining force was and continues to be important. So I call this the matriarchs' survivance and continuance. So this is my great-grandmother, Small Dutta. Dutta means elder in Kahnyen'kehàka. Her name was Mary Sky. And I never met her. Maybe I was a wee baby, but I think it's important for me, and people always ask me who my role models are, and I look back and I see these matriarchs who had gone through massive colonial disruption, who maintained and continued their work as Ongwahoi people, or what we'd say Ganongwahoi women. She was a corn husk craftsperson. You can see her right in this photo. She's crafting corn, braiding them and tying the corn to make mats, ceremonial clothes, and whatever else, moccasins, things like that. She was from the Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan. She was a leader. She held the Hiawatha Clan Mother title. So that is one of the leadership positions and related to our Confederacy Council. So she looked after the Turtle Clan. She was a farmer. She had livestock, and a working garden, and she was a midwife. So she was the ultimate life sustainer, and really to have her in my ancestry. And when I approach my work, I always think back to those ancestors and how they continued through their colonial disruption to be creative, to use their hands and their bodies for sustenance. And they continued their community and culture, and community literally birthing children, catching children. It's my grandmother on my father's side. So Small Dutta was on my mother's side, matrilineal side. And then this is my father's grandmother. Grandma Bun, her name was Elda M. Smith, Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan. She was the daughter of my great-grandmother, who was a residential school survivor at the Mohawk Institute. She went there from the age of around 3 until 16. And when my great-grandmother came out of the school, she had a family. And one of them is my grandmother. And so we have that history of colonial disruption through the residential school system directly on my father's side. And the work that I do now, and we'll talk about it at the very end, is really much about processing that and continuance and truth and discovery of how these impacts are continuing to affect people. She was, I guess, for a lack of a better term, she was a Renaissance woman. She did everything, and everything she did well. She revived the lost art of pottery making in Six Nations community. So for a time, people stopped making pottery because we were buying pots and pans. And so she did her own research. She went to, studied at museums. She learned contemporary pottery making and brought that back to Six Nations. She was also foundational in creating the Six Nations Arts Guilds. So supporting other artists to learn. She bought antiques, she sold antiques, she did leather work, she was a builder, she built houses. And I was talking to my dad last night about her. She built cabinets. she was just also, again, in a similar way, surviving through her artistry, surviving through her own initiative, her adaptability, her resilience, and expressing and doing life-sustaining, generating wage from her work. So those are two of my powerful ancestors that I call on when I do my work. I work directly with her. I'm working on a piece now called Talking Earth, which is commissioned through the Gardner Museum, which will premiere in June. And so this is my grandmother. She presented a piece of pottery to Queen Elizabeth at Expo 1967. But I wanted to take a look at the pottery. So you'll see it's kind of a contemporary shape. The color she researched so that it could look like our ancient shards, which is a darker brown color. And she designed on their wampum belts. So that's the Hiawatha belt and a friendship belt in the back. And I can't remember what that one is. And so through her artistry, she was relaying story. She was rebuilding knowledge and representing it in a way that people could interpret and see in a creative way. And I wanted to say that this was groundbreaking to do that. And of course, when you're doing something that's groundbreaking, there's naysayers and yes, amazing sayer people who, so she had to, as an artist, also deal with those impacts of what people were responding to and in particular representing visually wampum belts. Okay, so here's an example of, I'll just go through this really quickly because I'm not going to focus on me so much, but how it relates to accessing instinctive creativity, identity, and returning home. The photo, mock-up photo on the right is what's going to be happening in June. So the piece of pottery in the back I created. It'll be fragmented and put together, and we'll animate it with some of my family designs and my ancestors, and then we'll 3D map the building. But this is only really to show you how looking back at ancestral knowledge and the work that my ancestors have done have flowing through me and continuing. This is me. I trained at the National Ballet, which is quite a departure in very Western-based ballet. The reason being is because I love movement and dance, and I broke both my legs and had to learn to walk 3 times and went into classical training as therapy. And that's how I got into formal dance training. I put this in here because at that time there was no role models in Western-based forms of performance, and my parents were really concerned. They didn't want me to go to the National Ballet. They were like, oh gosh, they were worried because we had that sort of boarding school colonial history. I had to stay there. We had all of those fears and worries of me being away in a school and an institute. I, of course, wanted to go because of my love of dance and performance. So they took it upon themselves to research, and one of the role models was Maria Tallchief, dancer and married to Balanchine, and she had a school in Chicago, which we went to, but we went when they were closed, so we never got to actually meet her. But this is she, is somebody that I looked to from afar to see that there were other Indigenous dance artists. And then this was I'll just go through some imagery, the importance of going from that very Western form, breaking from it, and then moving into more contemporary and really launching into the rediscovery of our traditional dances, our philosophy, although that had always been there in my upbringing, but more through the embodiment of my work. So you have transformation from the ballet to the thing. So, and then I founded Kahawi Dance Theater, and this is just some information about Kahawi. 2005, but prior to that, I was an independent artist, choreographer, exploring. In 1996 was the first time that I created work that represented Indigenous or Ongwahoi stories of Sky Woman and corn beans and squash. And right now, this is just some information, but the bottom line is important: reframing the organization through Kahnyen'kehàka. So that's what we're working on right now. Last year we went through and we will continue to go through a series of research and development for planning. And that is lifelong working document style of collecting information and from community, from elders, from language speakers, from different Ongwahoi reserves, and making a working document, because there's so much to gather, there's so much information to research. So it's really launched into this research process. And these are just some of our images of different productions, lots of collaborations with other Indigenous artists. This year is in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Japan, working with Ainu artists in Japan. Creation story, intergenerational work, also an intergenerational, intercultural Indigenous collaboration piece. And so here's the information that I really wanted to talk about, particularly because it's a little bit about where we're moving and what's really important to me as an artist now. And I feel aligning with many other artists, Indigenous artists, who are thinking about space, place, thinking about land, thinking about sustainability, and making those powerful connections. And I started to really enjoy, part of also coming from my ancestors, cultivating the land and thinking about Indigenous systems of horticulture. And because all of our work aligns with natural patterning and natural forces. And everything we do traditionally in ceremony cycles, on our songs and our dances, is to align with the natural laws, natural patterns. And as an artist, as a dancer, an embodied person, I'm very interested in how to align my body within that, and how my body is, in fact, natural patterns, and how to just continue with my exploration of that. So I started in, I think it was 2017, a workshop series. Well, before that I was doing creation labs, so it would take us into the land, but I started a creation series called Inviting the Land to Shape Us. So it was really flipping the idea of the artist being the, I am the creator, I have all the ideas, but really dropping that kind of, and then listening and trying to attune and trying to sync, so that outside the land, inviting the land to move us, shape us, and have that as the creation process. And I continue to do that style of creation through all of my productions. But that didn't end there. It kind of went into, well, taking that into the organization on an organizational level, how we need to, what was initiated creativity needs to filter into the organization ecosystem of that. I think we have time to share this little video. This is the all the natural patterns made manifest in design. Some of the land-based work. Just really getting into the land. In the waters. Okay, I'm going to stop that because we want to go on to some of this information. So that was a little example of how we actually, it's important to action all of these ideas, that you get into the land. If you could see my hands now, they're not looking so good because I started planting. So we're in our planting season right now. So here's some of the questions that we continue to ask ourselves. revitalizing, reframing our processes, actioning our own ways. So these are the questions, some of the questions that we think about. And thinking about this through Kahnyen'kehàka, but also in these natural patterning ways and sustaining ways. How do we manage people? What is our ecosystem? How do we plan, create programs and program events? How do we build, sustain long-term relationships? How do we cultivate our spaces? How does rest and restoration factor in? That was a really important one through our investigations of what is growth look like and what does rest and restoration have to do with being healthy, and actually an important part of natural processes. Looking at what our agreements look like, treaty making, what is indigenous currency. Maybe we can think about different ways of exchange. What is the process of identifying and removing colonial burdens? So these are some of the ongoing questions that I have, which we ask in many different ways to many different people, depending upon who they are. For example, Kahnyen'kehàka, language speaker, would have completely different ways of describing some of these. And so I wanted to share a little bit about my natural patterns, in terms of thinking about it as Indigenous knowledge, science, and consciousness. And a lot of this work, it's out there. This is a way if I put it together, and many people are doing academic work about it. Many people and other Indigenous artists actually are land workers or earth workers, are working through this process. One of them that I really admire is Roxanne Schwenzel. She's a potter from New Mexico, but she also has the Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute, and she shares a lot of this information. A lot of this information also comes from looking at permaculture, but permaculture also then is founded on indigenous ways of horticulture. One of the things, and the reason why I showed the pottery, is because of pattern recognition and literacy. And patterns are super important. They exist in every culture, and then there's ones that are replicated everywhere in everything. And looking to natural laws, for example, the general model that just exists everywhere in our own body. How form is created through interactions of energy. And this goes back to when I think of creating form and shape through movement, that it goes into that energetic, again, having the land shape and form us. Reciprocal and regenerative design and planning. So always thinking about how we can create a really great yield, how that can be sustainable, self-sustaining, how we can work collaboratively and interconnected. And a really important one for me, especially during the pandemic, is being responsive. So that includes being adaptable. And what I had heard many years ago and continue to hear every once in a while, the sense of Indigenous readiness. So that means because of maybe pre-colonial, we were like that as well, but because of the colonial project, there has been a sense of us to always be ready to do things, which means shifting very, very quickly and moving. And I think that served me and Kahawi Dance Theater during the pandemic, that we were able to shift, we were able to be ready, we were able to adapt. This is a really, because we're in this very early stages, this is an early example of a planning model. So our models will be all pictorial in the end. And this was just a sketch from one of our sessions I thought I'd share, but you get to see how this is following general model principles. And I'll have a little bit of time to talk about some of the principles that are really important for me to continue to investigate. Branching. So that previous example was a branching system. You can study this. This is out there. This is just a little compilation of information that I've been collecting. Growth and flow, accumulations and dispersals. So you looking at it, what does it look like in the natural, in the nature, rivers, lungs, trees? What does it look for? And I say symbols here, but these are Ongohoe symbols, the tree of peace, white roots of peace. And these symbols come into my artistic work. And then you can think about it in organizational implications. So that's how I really wanted to connect my visual sources of inspiration for my artwork, but also then how it comes into the company. It's a way of structuring a governance model. How do people come to Gahawi, which relates to the white roots of peace, traveling the pathway of the roots to take shelter under the tree. So there, it can go into very philosophical, very conscious-based understandings of how we connect to people, and how we travel, and how intersections happen, and how we actually might want to work. So one of the important, interesting things of working in pods or groups that organize different aspects of the company. So we haven't really actualized some of these yet, but these are ideas that have been coming around, and the importance of rest and rejuvenation. That time when in the tree, when the fruits happen and the fruits come into the earth, and then they stay dormant and they rest in the earth. And so that's really important when we start thinking about programming. When do we rest? And right now, as everything is opening, I'm not resting. I am like, boo, boo, boo. It's just like, okay, there's a lot of things to process here. There's a lot of things to think about, and getting back to this. And then the importance of dreaming and visioning times, which sometimes we don't even have time for anymore. And that's the important part of, for the organization, for an artist. Here's an example. General model. Tessellations are nets, expansive. They can expand and they contract. And that's really important when you think about an organization or any living entity, is that the ability to move, to expand and contract, the ability to shift, but it's the most powerful form. It's the most powerful structure. And represented in nature is turtle shell, tree bark, anything hexagonal, snowflakes, dried clay cracks. Symbols, 6 directions. So a lot of times people say 4 directions. Sometimes people say 6 directions. There are 4 cardinal directions in the sky world and the underworld. And then going in, you can see there's not much fleshed out here, but we do have more information. We have 2 giant documents developing, but this is a little summary. Here's an example of what a net looks like. And spirals, it's the movement of energy in its summation. So this could be also like the Fibonacci series. Represented in nature, it's shells, pinecone sunflowers, which I'm planting right now, the movement of the cosmos, our DNA, our bones spiral, and we don't actually have any straight line in our body. Examples within our Ongohoe symbols are our celestial dome and plants, and you can see, if you're looking at my photo, these are an example of that replicated. Organization, this is really important, coming up to my time, but this is really important. And it was a kind of an aha moment for me, that what does our growth look like? I was always struggling with my organization, bigger, more, bigger, more and more. And you had to be going on this exponential growth, more money, more projects, more touring, more people, bigger organization. And there was a time back in 2017, when we were 18, we were going like that. And then we had a little disruption. And then we stopped, and it was like, oh, that's a failure. That is a failure. We're not continuing to grow. But in fact, it was the best thing that could have happened, because we had to sit back and say, is that really how we want to grow? Is that really what we want to be going bigger, better, whatever? And for me, it didn't feel right. It felt, I didn't want to be doing that. It was sort of that rat race feeling of always, everything has to be moving in this exponential ratio as opposed to additive, and as opposed to allowing for that expansion and contraction. So maybe this year we're contracting down, or the next 3 years we're contracting down a little bit, we're resting, and then the next we're expanding. So that is more natural, that summation, that movement. And it also, exponential growth is not good. And that's what's really actually affecting our society in a negative way. Exponential virus growth, exponential, commodity consumption. That's it's doing harm, and I think it's harmful for organizations to be working in that model. An example of that. These are my sunflowers from last year. Coming up to the very end, spirals and spheres, spheres within spheres. And this is important because of all of these reasons. But for what's important for an organization is that centering, that center point, maintaining a strong center point on the rings, or you could think about the years, all the people around. It's represented in our wampum belts, our circle wampum belt. It's represented in our songs and dance cycles, ceremonial cycles. But it also represents strength. So Roxanne Schwetzel, I can maybe share her link. There's a beautiful video that she has where she describes a basket, and it's lots of circles together, and to have a stable, more stable and strong basket is the more. And as soon as you start taking out circles, the basket becomes weakened and there's no centering, and you become wobbling around like that. And we know that from dancing. If you're not centered, you can't spin properly. So that's an example of that. And the circles can go right on through each other. She explains that as well. All of that knowledge that's happened there, all of that growth. And one last one that I'll share is stacking. It's also called annotation. It's the layering, and this is our Kahnyen'kehàka horticulture system. We just look to nature as the greatest teacher and replicated it. That's looking at a forest, the layering of a landscape, how soil rejuvenation, and then so the symbols would be our Kahnyen'kehàka planting system, our companion planting for what it would be called now, which gives the best yield. And that's important because you're planning how to get the best yield. It doesn't mean more yield. It just means, the richest yield, the more regenerative, the more it's impacting the soil better. Corn, beans, and squash are planted in a companion trio. But that's what people say now. But now, through my research, also sunflowers were planted for a number of reasons. And then there's lots of things that I'm learning about planting, the way that our ancestors did to cultivate soil. So that's really important. And then in terms of organizations, it's sort of like, who are our companion organizations or interconnected companies? So we can think about, and they don't necessarily have to be similar to you. In fact, it's better that if you're missing something and then somebody else, say I'm missing nitrogen, and somebody else is producing nitrogen really well. Well, I want to come in and work with them so that we can grow together. And then my height, my stock, or whatever can support them. So it's like it's reciprocal, and approaching so you can look at that as externally outreaching and seeing who else could be a companion, but also internally as an organization. How can you layer your own internal systems that are producing the best yield? So those are, there was a video, I'll show it quickly. It's very short. So this is my garden from last year. We did a lot of work in the land. So cultivated the land, created choreography, but with this consciousness of creating space. So I grew a stage, and that had to do with adaptability, because everybody was saying, oh, we can't perform, there's no theater. Well, we'll make a theater. We're going to make an outdoor stage. And that was a part of our responsiveness. That was a part of our adaptability and our continuing growth and expansion. So these beautiful my dancers. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing there because I could go on, but I'm at my end, I think.
Thank you, Santee.
Sharing? Did you stop sharing for me? Okay, great.
Yes. Thank you. We can go on. Like I've been saying to a lot of the artists, this is the multi-arts festival and conference for IBPOC persons. Time is what we make it, and I value everyone who's been here or is on the as attendees of participants' time. But if we need to go over a couple of minutes just to like, this is ours. It's meant for this reason to be as adaptable and flexible as you mentioned in response to the time and the needs. And I want to say thank you. So this idea of actually centering your practice in the land and in your history, and also starting with the stories that matter, is also something that I've been unpacking in my own research around how important it is for IBPOC persons to actually start with the stories, because it's a lineage that comes from way before. And it's actually sometimes outside of what is this, again, this colonial structure. And I do believe that in Moulding the Future, I think it's important that we begin to allow for these stories to bubble up in the ways that you've mentioned, both the matriarchal, the patriarchal, and land. I don't know if there's anyone who has a question out there in the chat, but I have one for you to start. We could just spend a minute or so in it. This idea of being a creator and an artist on this land, is this indigenous land. As someone who's not indigenous, and as many of the attendees are, how can we begin to think about centering any aspects of indigeneity in our practice to honor the lands in which we are creating and administering and doing the arts? What are your thoughts on that? It's a big thing, but maybe one advice, one thing that you could share.
Hi. Okay, sorry, people were just leaving.
Oh,
okay. Yeah, that's a good question, because I think it just has to do, and I mean, it's even hard for us, for me, and I showed you that photo of us working in our traditional homelands, that's going into our traditional territory and rediscovering. So I would imagine it's something very similar of going onto other lands and discovering as well. And I can try to think about when I go into another land, when I do my collaborations in Aotearoa, for example, that I'm indigenous, but my lands are not in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But because of the way that we're working, the work is put into the land. So I get off the plane, literally the first thing I do is I go into a body of water. That's not even that's just to ground myself into that space. Might be harder if you're going to an urban city or something like that, but an action that really connects you to that space, that place, in an honoring and acknowledgement way, almost like an introduction to yourself into that space. And I think it has to go embodied. For me, I'm an embodied person, so I'm like, if you stay intellectual about it, that's one thing. a lot of the times we're in performance because we're connecting minds and hearts, and we're connecting and working with our body. And so it's important that we do that work. The other thing that I do is I always make sure that I go through other people's, acknowledge their protocols. So I'm not coming in and imposing what I do, but I really, like for Aotearoa, they're really, Maori people are very rich and powerful in their ways. So I've been invited into that. And then there's a sense of commitment and responsibility. So I don't just do one-off collaborations. So my commitment to working with and collaborating with Maori artists has been years in the making. So I just don't pop over and like, oh, I'm going to do the show, show me your stuff, and then I'm going to go off and do this show, because it's very about this relationship building. And I think that applies to any kind of, a lot of the times we kind of have to work in one-off scenarios, but when it's your project and you're leading it and you're invested in it, to think about this long-term relationship. Similar if you're here in Canada and you're from somewhere else and you want to either collaborate or, acknowledge the land, it's a long-term commitment. It's a long-term education, and it's not something that you can do one thing and, oh, I did the land acknowledgement, now I'm good. It's like, and people will see that. I think people, if you're coming to work and collaborate, people will see if you're in it for the right reasons. Sometimes there's been lots of critique about reconciliation projects where it's like, oh, let's do a reconciliation project, and it becomes very transparent and lacking in collective and exchange and responsibility and listening and learning and the time it needs to take. So those are some examples. And finding people to teach, there's lots of resources, different places people can go, and people to reach out to in different communities, because it's Canada. Turtle Island in itself is so vast, and I can't speak for every nation, and I don't. So it's really putting that investment in the work behind it. That answers.
Thank you. There's a beautiful thing around, also you mentioned around time, and in thinking about touring and many ways in which I also go to work, I realize that I may go into a community, a particular Indigenous space, and maybe it's going in a day earlier to make sure that I'm acknowledging that particular space and that particular history. Maybe it's also staying a day later. When you think about touring, you go, all right, I'm going to go in, I'd land, I perform, and the next day you're out. Could it be that we begin to think about spending a day with our artists in that particular space and finding elders that we could connect with and actually honor the land where a theater might be built on, in our performance, actually begin to honor that as well. I want to say thank you. Thank you from the bottom. I'm going to get very Jamaican. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's so great to see your teachings and your connections to the land and to your own practice and the ways in which you're sharing that with the world, both digitally and also physically. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know we'll work again in the future. So again, I want to say thank you. And I'm sure we've learned so much about the way you think about artistic practice, but also the ways in which you're moving that into the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day and conversations.